I'm going to just introduce our speaker, David James. Now, just to give a little bit of background, I met David through U3A, through a class that I involved in there. And a few months ago, he gave this interesting talk, which had maps in it. And I thought, oh, maybe this might be something interesting for the map group. So I twisted the arms of Kay and Len and Neville, and they agreed to have this meeting, which we had there was a bit of a gap in the program. So David kindly agreed to repeat the talk. So we're going to be talking about the Portuguese age of exploration, and then end up with the interesting question of whether the Portuguese discovered Australia before the Dutch came along. So that's going to be an interesting point. Now, David, in an earlier life, was a commercial pilot, so he has an interest in maps, although I don't think that he had a map in the aircraft cockpit. It was more like a GPS, I imagine. But he certainly does have an interest in the whole question of where we are on the surface of this planet. So I'll pass over to David. He has a presentation to give, and then we'll have a question and answer session afterwards, and then go on to having a morning tea. So hand over to you, David.
Thanks, Rob. As you say, an interest in maps, and that forms quite a part of this presentation today. But good morning, and pleasure to be here. This presentation, as you can see, is about the Portuguese age of exploration. So am I an expert on the subject? Well, not really. My interest in this subject came when I attended the Alice Springs Sacred Heart Catholic Primary School in the early 50s. And the teachers there, Mother Mary Six of the Best and Sister Mary Corporal Punishment, were very keen on teaching this subject and its influence on the world. In other words, the spreading of the true faith. Meanwhile, at the state school, I think it was more the British Empire. So, moving right along, is this going to let me down, or is it not? Excuse me, folks. Oh, there we go. Sorry about this. Oh, yes, now I've got it. The presentation will be in two parts: history and mapping. The history is all well documented and 100% true, but much of part two, because it's to do with Portuguese in Australia, is speculation. So what are we talking about in history is the lead up to the age of exploration, Portugal's motivation to explore the oceans, maritime innovations, the two types of ships they use, caravels and carracks, Henry the Navigator, the early discoveries, Bartholomew Diaz, Vasco da Gama, some of the later discoveries, Alphonse Albuquerque, Portugal and Spain sharing the world, Ferdinand Magellan, and then some echoes of empire. Now, in part two, mapping, I'll be talking about the discovery of Australia and New Zealand by the Portuguese with a question mark, Portuguese mapping, the Dieppe maps, the Vallard Atlas, and the modern reconstructions of the Vallard maps, and interesting facts which I picked up along the way. So the lead up to the age of exploration. It really started for the Portuguese with the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula by the Moors, which was completed by about 1750. And as you can see on the map there, they had most of the Iberian Peninsula under Moorish control into the south of France. The only area that remained unconquered in the Iberian Peninsula was a little strip at the top, which is today where the Basques live. So there was 500 years of Arab and Berber occupation, and this led to a pathological hatred of the Moors by Portugal. So there was plenty of conflict during that time until the Portuguese reconquista, when they recovered the land from the Moors, and they were helped a lot by the Second Crusade that left England and arrived in Portugal to help with the liberation of Lisbon in 1147. There was almost continual conflict with other Iberian kingdoms. It wasn't until 1249 that all of Portugal was recovered by the Christian armies in the Algarve in 1249. So the Portuguese motivation to explore the oceans. There was the search for gold, the slave trade, the spice trade, to find the kingdom of Prester John, and competition with the Spanish. In a way, Portugal was at the end of the line for spices and innovations from the rest of Europe, because they were cut off from the rest of Europe by Spain, their arch enemy. Prester John was, in medieval Europe, a mythical king of a lost Christian realm, somewhere in Asia or Africa. The myth was widely believed to be true in medieval Europe. Now, the motivation and ability to explore. Portugal, as you know, faces the North Atlantic, so that's their outlet. Other maritime trading nations concentrated on the Mediterranean, and because of the improved ships and navigation, the Portuguese were able to strike out into the North Atlantic. And this is a picture of a caravel. Lateen sails, a very important feature of early Portuguese ships. Lateen sails were developed in Southeast Asia. Muslim traders adopted them, and their use spread with the Arab expansion through the Levant and the Mediterranean. Latin sails were adopted by the Portuguese.
They're the triangular.
Pardon?
They're the triangular sails. I mean, what are Latin sails?
Those triangular ones, yeah. So the advantages of Latin sails are what I'm going to talk about next. And I apologise if this is a bit basic. Anybody who knows anything about sailing will already know this. But it is an important factor in the ability of the Portuguese to break out of Portugal and sail as far as they did. But with Latin sails, you can sail more efficiently into the wind. And here you see illustrated how you can get within 45 degrees of the wind, whereas a traditional square-rigged ship can only manage about 60 degrees. So in effect, there's twice as many tacks required, much greater time just to cover the same distance. So it was a big advantage. And it was adopted from the Moors, ironically.
They look like the sails on the Nile, don't they?
Yes, yes. They are the very same sort of sail. So the two types of ships that the Portuguese used were the caravel, which was smaller, used Latin sails and could get nearer to the shore because it drew less, and it was very good, therefore, for exploration. Carracks were bigger and could carry a lot more. The carracks were used for trade generally after the routes were established and the currents and winds were better known. Henry the Navigator, a very important man in this story. He was born in 1394. He was the fourth child of King John I of Portugal. His mother was Philippa of Lancaster, an English noblewoman. He played a leading role in the invasion and occupation of Ceuta in 1415. And Ceuta is on the north coast of Africa, it's part of Morocco today.
Oh, Morocco, is it?
Well, actually, I think it's still controlled by Spain, who took it away from Portugal, but it's surrounded by Morocco and it's on the north coast, a little bit southeast of Gibraltar. As I mentioned, his mother was the daughter of John, was an English noblewoman. She was the daughter of John of Gaunt. And that union led to the Treaty of Windsor between England and Portugal. And we'll come to some more about that later on. And Ceuta was Portugal's first overseas conquest. And to put it into context, it was the same year, 1415, as the Battle of Agincourt. So we're talking longbows, swords, shields, lances, no firearms. So until Henry, the sailors more or less kept Africa on their left, southbound, and on their right, northbound. He oversaw the improvement of ships and navigation, used and improved Greek and Arab astrolabes and quadrant, studied prevailing winds and currents, and encouraged exploration south of Cape Bojador. Henry the Navigator, and under his administration, Portuguese sailors sailed south of the Cape of Bojador, and by the time of his death, they had discovered the Gambia River and reached Cape Palmas.
When did he die?
Pardon?
When did he die?
Can't tell you exactly, but he lived to about 60.
He was actually king in Portugal, or what was his role?
Oh, he was of the royal family. His father was king. He was never king himself. But he was very, very influential in kicking off the age of exploration. Early discoveries in the 1400s, the Madeira Islands, 1419, the Azores, 1427, Cape Verde Islands in 1456, Congo River, 1484, and Cape of Good Hope, 1491. Madeira, the Azores, and the Cape Verde Islands were all uninhabited when they were discovered. The Canaries, which are not named after birds, but after dogs, from the Latin word for dog, they were inhabited and they had been known since the time of the Carthaginians. The Portuguese visited there in the 1300s.
Excuse me, what do you mean by early discovery?
They're early in the Portuguese age of discovery, in the late 1400s into the early 1500s. Pardon?
Unknown by the rest of Europe?
Yes, unknown by the rest of Europe. Yes. So now we move on to Bartholomew Diaz. He was a very important explorer and made a great leap forward in sailing around the Cape. He sailed with 2 caravels and a carrack in 1487, and he was the first captain to make and round the Cape of Good Hope. He landed on the East African coast and was obliged to sail back. He wanted to go on to find India and the riches in that part of the world, but his crew didn't want to be part of it. They were uncooperative, so he turned back. As you can see, he sailed well west of the coast, turned east with the Roaring Forties, and actually didn't sight the Cape when he passed it, but he thought it was about time to head north, which he did, and landed on the southeast African coast. And he only sighted the Cape on his return voyage. The next really important mariner was Vasco da Gama, who I'm sure you've all heard of. He sailed in 1498 with a fleet of 4 ships. He used Diaz's experience and detoured well to the west of the African coast and south to the latitude of Cape of Good Hope, which he knew from Diaz's explorations. He turned east with the Roaring Forties. He made in total 3 voyages to India, and he died in India on the 3rd voyage. The second voyage was a big event, total of 20 ships left Portugal. There were savage conflicts with the Arabs and the Indians, and the Portuguese won out because they had the advantage of bigger ships, bigger cannons, and of course they were fighting infidels, so they had God on their side. Some later discoveries in the 1500s, Brazil, a very important one for Portugal. Beyond the Cape, the East African coast, India, Ceylon, Persian, Arabian Gulfs, Spice Islands, and they actually made it to Japan by 1542. Quite an amazing thing when you think how long these voyages took. To get to Goa in India was at least 6-7 months.
One of the crew wants to go home.
Yes. Later on, they were keen to go further because of the riches they could
What's
get
the
their hands
green
on.
all about?
Pardon?
What's the green all about?
Settlement.
Oh, they are settlements
That's where they settle.
and areas of influence, trading posts that they were set up by the Portuguese. Another very important man was Alfonso de Albuquerque. He was a true empire builder of the Portuguese possessions in India. He was Viceroy of India from 1509 to 1515. A great military leader, and he followed Vasco da Gama to India, conquered Goa in 1510, conquered Malacca, which is now in Malaysia, now called Malaysia, in 1511, and conquered the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea and controlled those areas. Portugal and Spain sharing the globe. The Pope wanted to minimize the conflict between Portugal and Spain. So he put out a papal bull in 1493, which resulted in the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. And that split the globe, as you can see. To the left was all Spanish, to the right, all Portuguese. And you can see the line runs down, here through East Australia. It was modified a bit with the Treaty of Zaragoza in 1529, which moved this line of longitude over a bit and gave the Portuguese more room to expand in Brazil. Ferdinand Magellan, whom we all know is is said to be the first man that circumnavigated the globe, but he didn't actually because he was killed in the Philippines. He was Portuguese, but he sailed for the Spanish because he had a falling out with the King of Portugal. He had 5 ships and 270 men, and he was searching for the Spice Islands by sailing west. I guess he got a bit of a clue from Columbus. the first European to sail around South America. So he discovered and named the Magellan Straits, was the first to see and traverse the Pacific, and it was the first expedition to circumnavigate the globe. The return was reduced to just one ship, 19 men, and it was about 3 years after they set out. The leader or the captain of that last remaining ship was Juan Sebastian Elcona, a Basque resident, or ethnically Basque. Magellan actually did circumnavigate the world, really, because he'd been, for the Portuguese, he'd been to the Spice Islands twice, in fact. So there's a little bit missing. He didn't quite make it down from or anywhere past the Philippines. So this is the Portuguese world in 1550, and pretty widespread. They even visited Labrador and Newfoundland, and a huge influence all the way through to Japan. And you can see they colonised Timor in 1512, not very far from Australia. It's said that the empire was at its greatest extent in 1815, mainly because it later expanded a lot in Brazil.
When did the British take over those southern Atlantic islands?
Yeah, I can't tell you the exact date, but I come to that in a minute.
Okay.
Here are some random facts that I came across in my research. The Treaty of Windsor, which I mentioned before, is the longest international treaty ever signed, and is still active today between Portugal and England. And it was last sort of used in the Second World War when England persuaded Portugal to remain neutral in the Second World War. So surprising that it still had an influence so long after it was signed. South. One of the islands in Cape Verde is called Sal, and it just means salt, and it is a salt island. And you'll see later in one of the Ballard maps of New Zealand, they also named an island Sal there. I haven't been to the one in New Zealand, but I've been to the one in the North Atlantic. Very boring place. The next is St Andrews, St Jacobs, St James's, and Kunta Kinte Island. It's an island in the mouth of the Gambia River, and it was used as a sort of a collection point for slaves from West Africa, were housed there before they were shipped out to the Americas. And St Andrews was the name that was given by the Portuguese, and Jacobs was a very unexpected colonial power. It was colonized briefly by the Duchy of Courland-Senegal, a vassal state of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, would you believe? And they also had a colony in the Caribbean, but I'd never heard of it. I never heard of the Commonwealth of Portugal and Lithuania, let alone the Duchy. The Vietnamese alphabet. Anybody been to Vietnam? Yeah, you notice that they don't use characters here, they use Latinized alphabet. That's down originally to the Portuguese. The French, of course, continued it. There was a union of Portugal and Spain between 1580 and 1640. And during that time, the Spanish tried to invade England, Spanish Armada, 1588. The Portuguese were involved. They had ships in the Armada. The reason that the union occurred was that there was a succession problem in the royal ruling class in Portugal. There was no successor, and the Spanish swooped in and became the royal leaders of a unionised Portugal and Spain. And the Portuguese got out from under the control of the Spanish by 1640 by various means. The other interesting fact I found out was about the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, a huge earthquake, which actually basically destroyed Lisbon, and the subsequent fire was dreadful, and a lot of the maritime records held in Lisbon were burned and lost completely. So there are echoes of the empire down to today. Macau was the last colony, and it went back in back to China in 1999, as I'm sure you will remember. And most African colonies gained independence in the mid-70s. And India took Goa back in 1961. And most of the Asian colonies were conquered by the Dutch and the English by the end of the 1600s. The Portuguese today is the 9th most widely spoken language in the world, with 234 million speakers, most of them in Brazil. The autonomous regions of Portugal today are Madeira, the Azores, and Portugal itself. But speaking of takeover by the Dutch and the British, a good case in point is Ceylon, or what we now call Sri Lanka. It was initially colonised by the Portuguese, who were kicked out by the Dutch, who were kicked out by the English, until Sri Lanka became independent in 1948. And Timor was a colony until 1975, when it was taken over by Indonesia and held till 1999, when the eastern part of the island gained independence, as I'm sure you will remember.
And Bombay was part of the wedding dowry of Catherine of Braganza when she married Charles.
Oh, is that so?
Bombay.
Interesting. Yeah, very good.
But they've been besties for a long time.
Now we come to part two, the maps stuff, which as a maps group will be of more interest to you. But first I'm going to digress a bit. As a former international airline pilot, I was of course a great user of maps and GPS, as Ralph said. The world map is usually shown in a Mercator projection, as we all know, and it's the picture we have in our minds of how the world looks. This type of map, as I'm sure you're aware, distorts the size and shapes of lands near the poles. And this really came home to me once on a flight from Frankfurt in Germany to Anchorage in Alaska. In my mental picture, because of a lifetime of looking at the Mercator projection of the world, my mindset was, Alaska, Anchorage, west of Frankfurt. No. The Great Circle track goes over the top of the world, and we flew out over the North Sea, flew to the north of Iceland and Greenland, just a little bit south of the pole, and came into Alaska, as you can see on the red line, over the north coast.
It's like a
So-
detour, doesn't it?
Yeah, so the black line is what was in my mind. The red line is what we actually did. Much, much shorter.
Oh my God.
Okay, now we move to the contentious bit. The Portuguese discovery of Australia and New Zealand with question marks. My interest in this subject was aroused by reading the book illustrated you, which I've got here on the screen, which was by Peter Trickett. His book strongly supports the Portuguese discovery of Australia about 200 years before Cook. And since the mid-1800s, various people have suggested a Portuguese presence around Australia. However, there are plenty of people who don't believe a word of it. And there's a 3-volume book by an author called Tasker that presents a completely different view, claiming that there's no proof of any Portuguese presence. But the books are there illustrated. The one I read by Peter Trickett, published in 2007. There were 2 previous books by different authors, and the 3 volumes by Tasker, all debunking the idea, were published in 2017.
What advice did he debunk it all?
Coming to that.
I'm jumping the gun, don't you? Well, it's all about- This is
There's a perfect example of a forward thinker. So, oh, was a sneeze.
upstairs.
Oh, it's just the face of the word.
Oh, okay.
Someone who wasn't inside, they can't get enough.
So now we come to some well-known things. The island of Gold was mentioned by Marco Polo and Java La Grande. The Portuguese were aware of Marco Polo's travels and his writings, and he mentions a southern land named Java La Grande as the island of gold. And that was widely believed that there was an island of gold in medieval times. There's 3 types of evidence supporting the possible discovery by the Portuguese, and they are the Dieppe and other ancient maps. As the maps group, you'd probably be aware of the Dieppe maps. Also indigenous legends and language is a type of evidence, and some physical evidence. But Dieppe is in Normandy in France, and it was home to the Dieppe School of Hydrography in the 16th century. So some more information on Trickett's postulation that it's true. His candidate for the discoverer is Christopher de Mendoza. There are records that show that he was sent to find the island of gold. He was in the East Indies at the appropriate time, that's on record, but then there are large gaps in the ancient records regarding his movements. And Trickett believes that his voyages were kept secret as he was sailing in Spain's part of the world. Trickett believes the only surviving evidence are the Ballard maps, which were held in Dieppe. More about the Ballard Atlas later. Now, here's a very interesting ancient map by Heinrich Bunting, his world map, published in Germany in 1581. And as you can see, coast of Western Australia is pretty accurately depicted. Its longitude is far from correct, but then they had a lot of trouble figuring out longitude in those days. But this map was made about 30 years before the Dutch allegedly first certainly discovered the west coast of Western Australia. So Trickett says that Bunting had by some means seen the Portuguese maps. And this map actually, interestingly, only shows the Portuguese portion of the world. So he thinks that that's significant also. Now, come to actual Portuguese mapping and the way they did it. The captains created maps on animal skins that were called portolans. And most of the maps depicted south up. Later atlases and later atlas producers arranged the portolans as they thought best, because the portlands were needed to be assembled to get an idea of the orientation of maps because they were done as they went along. But keep in mind that in the 16th century, mariners had no telescopes and no reliable method of calculating longitude. Mercator was in the habit of producing maps north up, and his maps became very popular, and that became the standard. That's why we have maps that are north up today. So, Portuguese maps. The Vallard Atlas was created in Dieppe in 1547. It's now held, it's been in a few places, but it's eventually wound up in the Huntington Library in California. And it looks like the East Coast as far as the land jutting out to the east, but remember it's south up. Trickett believes that the land jutting out to the east is due to an incorrect orientation of a portland. Now here's a picture of the Vallard Atlas map, inverted north up. And the section to the south of Botany Bay is turned 90 degrees clockwise. So you can see where he's turned it here. And he believes this represents Cape York, Queensland, New South Wales, Botany Bay, Wilson's Promontory, and Spencer Gulf. Now, the Vallard maps were created in Dieppe, as I mentioned, in 1547. They're now held, oh, I'm repeating myself here. As I said, they're held in the Huntington Library in California, and this is a map of the West Coast. And Trickett has cleaned it up and simplified the Vallard originals. But he makes a good point that the original map makers, the Portuguese in his view, named the Abrolhos Islands, which in Old Portuguese means keep your eyes open or be alert. And interestingly, the Dutch use the same name. And it's not a Dutch word, it's a Portuguese word. So he makes a strong point there, I think. More Vallard maps, Queensland coast, Fraser Island, Moreton, and North Stradbroke Islands. And there are further maps that go right down around Wilson's Promontory. It's interesting that Cook's first map of the Queensland coast didn't show Moreton Bay because he thought, or didn't realise that North Stradbroke Island and Moreton Island were actually islands. He thought they were the mainland. But as you can see in the Vallard map, it's clearly two islands and Brisbane River.
What year is that?
That was printed in 1547.
Take a lot of navigation.
Pardon?
Take a lot of navigation.
Yes.
Prove those islands are there.
Yeah. So, but it's alleged that Christopher de Mendoza sailed south and then north, so he had ample opportunity to theoretically to make these maps. But how on earth?
The rugby bunches of theories. Did you reckon those Vallard maps are false? Forgery.
Well, he has generated these maps from the originals, which are held in the library, as I said, and they do come from Dieppe, and they are known to have been done in the mid 16th century.
They're not forgeries, so they really exist.
They do exist, yes,
That's
definitely.
right.
Yes.
So how do you debunk that?
I'm sorry. What?
The name of the Brisbane River on that map.
It's called Boa Porto, or Good Port in Portuguese, but of course I didn't know it was really the Brisbane River.
It wasn't, was it?
No.
It was a.
Yeah, a river. Yeah.
Shallow.
So I think that sort of thing is fairly convincing personally. The valid maps of New Zealand, Trickett postulates that, and there's some evidence that he cites of some of the ships that were in the small fleet that sailed around Australia were shipwrecked around Gable Island near the border of New South Wales and Victoria. And one remaining ship was driven east by a huge gale, which you often get across Bass Strait and across to New Zealand. And he believes that one of the carracks, which was square rigged, had no option but to run with the wind and wound up discovering the North Island of New Zealand.
They're obviously was drinking a lot. Like that.
Yeah, but he makes the point that they didn't have telescopes, and there are headlands are depicted as islands because they thought they were islands because they couldn't see they were connected to the mainland. So it's a bit of a long bow, I think, but anyway, he cites it as fairly reliable evidence. So now we move on to Indigenous legends. There are in the northwest in the Kimberleys, a linguist called Carl George von Brandenstein studied Kimberley languages for many years, and he believed, or he said, that there were up to 60 loan words in the Aboriginal language that came from Portuguese because of contact in medieval times between the Portuguese from Timor and other parts of Southeast Asia to the Kimberley area. More recent studies doubt this, that there are that many, but they do agree there are some. And there's one which is without doubt same word, same meaning in both languages. I'm trying to think how to pronounce it. It's Tartarunga, and it means turtle. Same word in both Portuguese and the Aboriginal languages with the same meaning. So he hangs a lot of faith on it. And back in the early 1900s, there were some interesting discoveries made in the Kimberley area in Napier Bay. Some bronze cannons were discovered. And also there was a corroboree witnessed and recorded in writing by one of the pearlers of a corroboree that was held, which seemed to commemorate an event in the distant past of the Aborigines, where they reenacted a landing in canoes where they had themselves clad in bark, with bark hats and what looked like crossbow replicas. And he claims, or the author claims, that it must be some sort of reenactment of an encounter between the Portuguese and the Aborigines. And the two cannons prove it, he thinks. Other people say, well, the cannons are bronze cannons, Portuguese style, but they might have been made in Macassar or somewhere under Portuguese influence. However, nobody will ever know for sure, I don't think. Aboriginal oral tradition in the southeast around Twofold Bay, where Trickett thinks one of the wrecks occurred near Gable Island. There are a few words, and one of the words is I've got it here. One of the bays there is called bitter versus or something. It's an Aboriginal word, bitter Portugese or something like that. And he claims that it's a corruption of Portuguese. So, you know, it's a pretty long bow, I think. But continue with physical evidence. The cannons were found in the northwest, and a very interesting find was made on the northern part of Fraser Island. The CSIRO were taking core samples in the sand, and they dredged up something from 2.2 meters under the sand, pulled it to the surface, and that's what it was, a lead sinker with a hole through it. And it was in a layer of pumice that had been spewed out of a volcano in the Pacific, and it was definitely dated to the mid-16th century. Further than that, the lead has been analysed and scientifically proven to come from either the Iberian Peninsula or central France. So I think that's fairly convincing evidence, but it's not to say that it was necessarily put there by a Portuguese explorer, but we'll never know. Also off Gabo Island, where Trickett believes there's a wreck, they've dredged up lots of broken pottery, including 2 intact pots that are from the 16th century. So that's pretty convincing. How's the time going? Oh, good. Further physical evidence. Twofold Bay in New South Wales. There's the ruins of a stone building, and Trickett. Oh, there's the name. I've just come across the name of that bay. It's Bit and Gabby, and somehow Trickett believes that it's linguistically linked to Portuguese, because the first researcher of language in the area of the Aborigines, it was started with a P rather than a B. It's again a pretty long bow, I think, but there it is. Anyway, these ruins exist in Twofold Bay. It's far from proven whether they're Portuguese or what the heck they are, but they could be early colonial. That's a pretty convincing evidence found in New Zealand. The helmet and the cannonball were dredged out of Wellington Harbour. The helmet is Portuguese style from the mid-16th century in every respect, with the crest at the top and its general close-fitting shape. The cannonball is of a diameter that was used in cannons by the Portuguese. And the Tamil bell, which could reasonably have been expected to be on a Portuguese ship because they were very involved in India, was found being used as a cooking pot by the Maoris. So all of those items are now in the museum in Wellington. But they're not regarded very, by historians, generally speaking, think it's a whole lot of rubbish, but they don't really have much answer for these things, how they get to be there. They've come up with a lot of weird ideas like, oh, it was used for ballast in a ship or something like that in the ship sector. But it'll probably never be proven, one way or the other. So some more interesting facts. There's a Portuguese, the Portuguese people, the public, are convinced that they discovered Australia. The Portuguese authorities are less so. However, they have been persuaded to issue a postage stamp, which you can see there, clearly Australia, kangaroos, and they've even issued a coin with a map of Australia on it. Now, that monument there has been built in Warrnambool, and the connection between Warrnambool and the Portuguese explorers is a so-called wreck of a mahogany ship, which was first sighted in 1836, a very long time ago, and it hasn't been sighted since. So, this festival that happens every year in Warrnambool is based on something that was seen in 1836 thought to be mahogany, not proved to be Portuguese, but on the strength of it, there's an annual festival of Portuguese culture every year in Warrnambool. So, in conclusion, I'll just make a few points, and I think the media's got a lot to do with what we hear about the Portuguese, possible Portuguese involvement in Australia. If it's a slow news week, I suspect that organisations rehash the discovery theory every so often, and usually they sensationalise and cater to the 3-minute attention span, presuming that things are fact when they're not proven. And in summary, though, I think Trickett presents a good case for the possibility. That's only my opinion. Tasker, the author of the 3 volumes against it, his opinion is largely no wreck, no case. He dismisses all theories based on maps and avoids discussion of some physical evidence. So, begs the question, what do you think? Anybody convinced?
No, can I ask a question about the map?
Yes.
Have there been any dating of the inks from the parchment?
Yes, yeah, they're definitely genuine.
From the time?
Yes, yes.
Someone had to be there. Someone had to be there.
Yeah.
To get those.
I mean, when I was in Greenwich in London, 214.
Bob? Let's see what you have. When I was in Greenwich in London in 214, I came across a map of the world which was in Chinese, and they had a blob, a circular type blob, where Australia is supposed to be. Anyway, it just so happened there were 3 Chinese guys nearby, so I asked them, could they read the writing? They said yes. And I said, that's Australia. That's what we call Australia, whether it was in China. Now that map was from about 1480.
Yeah, there's a book been written by an author called Menzies, and there was something on SBS about him some time ago. And yeah, that's right. Yeah,
It talks about
yeah,
China doing a lot more exploring
yes,
than we give credit to in that era before 1420.
yes.
But there was belief in that particular country that they were here long before even the Portuguese, possibly.
Yeah, yeah, well, it's possible, and I think you should have an open mind about those sorts of things.
Well,
Just
I-
because there's no
I'm
physical evidence doesn't mean it didn't happen.
not a British descent, so I have an open mind.
Any other questions?
The book was called 1492. 1492.
Yeah, that was Columbus. Yeah, he was Spanish sailing for the Italian sailing for the Spanish. Yes.
Yeah, I've got a cork business and I've had dealings with Portuguese before. And when I was visiting over there, I asked Carlos, as he was called, or Carlos, Portuguese, what do you know about discovering Australia? We learned in school. It was Portuguese.
They learned it in school, did they? That's very good.
And my interest was lifted by my old mate John Sinclair when he showed me a map which looked like Fraser Island sticking out, and I was involved with Fraser Island with John all those years ago, and it looks fairly obvious that they had very detailed knowledge. They knew it was an island, well, they drew it as an island anyway, and even Matthew Limbs didn't know that. He missed, but they came from the north. I'm really intrigued, and what you've said here is the sorts of things that I've written up, and I searched all those books, and I've lost one of them, who the hell they are. It just seems so obvious, and I'm a bit surprised that the opposition
Yeah, that's a point that Trickett makes, that traditional historians are very close-minded about, and he doesn't really understand why. But and also Tasker, who wrote 3 books opposing the idea, he dismisses the mapping as if it's just not true, can't be. And I think the mapping is the most convincing part of it, personally. But until they find a wreck, I don't think anybody's going to really truly believe it.
One of my friends worked on the dredge on Stradbroke Island, and I think he's still alive. He probably would kill me if he knew what I was saying. So if you know my friend that worked on, forget it. He was came across what is obviously an old boat in the sand when they were digging, and what they used to do there was they dug a big hole, filled it with water, and they put the dredge in it, and they moved it at the front, put all the sand at the back, and the lake just followed them along. And he was driving this dredge when it was obviously an old boat, well down from the sea, well inland from the sea. They stopped, the boss came out, keep calm, and he got chopped.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was one of the stories of that old boat. And Kath Walker told me it was the Spanish galley. It was obviously not wouldn't be Spanish, it would have been Portuguese like that if it was true.
Well, the Spanish were in the area. They named Torres Strait and discovered Torres Strait allegedly. But I think probably after the Portuguese knew about it.
Yeah.
But there's also been reports of an ancient shipwreck on the east coast of Australia.
Yeah, that's the one.
Oh, I thought you said Fraser. Oh, sorry. Oh, okay.
Just looking at it broadly, it seems that if the Portuguese are able to come from Portugal to the eastern part of Indonesia and to Timor, which, as I recall, is only about 200 miles from Darwin, taking those things into account, it seems unlikely that they would not, somebody at some stage would not have managed to land accidentally or on purpose in the northern parts of Australia. Seems one would think that that's the more likely answer to the question.
Yes,
it did happen.
Yes, it's not that it's too far away. It's nowhere near as far as they'd already sailed.
Well, nothing like it.
Just wanted to comment that if they actually found those 2 remote islands in the southern Atlantic, there's very little chance that they would have missed Australia.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the search for the Portuguese were very rapacious people, and then they wanted to find the island of gold. And when they didn't find any gold down here, I think they lost interest.
That's the way it is.
Yeah, that's right. Sometime later.
David, could we go back to the image you had of the Dieppe map?
Yeah.
With north to the top. And all the labels. Yeah, no, I know.
North of the top.
That one, yeah. Now, I'm sort of very much of 2 minds about all this. But when I first saw this map many years ago, I was struck by Fraser, Morton, Stradbroke. Now, I think the business about the Portlands possibly explains why that strange thing stuck out to the east. And I also question a couple of other things here, particularly the where is the bulge near Shoalwater Bay? But nonetheless, I just sort of, well, it seems to me that you cannot dismiss the evidence completely.
Yeah, I mean, it's even the best navigators in the world would have made the same mistakes at the time. It's surprising to me that it looks as much as it does like the current East Coast of Australia. But there are some big emissions like that. There's no 90 Mile Beach, there's no, and this longitude, you shouldn't actually be able to hear something. So, but bearing in mind that they were just adding up numbers about how fast they were sailing to calculate longitude, is not surprising that it's a little bit wonky.
Now, I have a question that's come in on Zoom from one of our members, so I think this is Warwick. Couldn't quite make it today. Going back to the early exploration prior to 1490, question mark, sailors stuck to the coast, but after went out into the Atlantic. Was there a change in the mapping, giving them more confidence to brave the ocean? That's the question.
Yeah, difficult question to answer, but
Excellent.
I think they just discovered the winds and the currents.
yeah, a lot of they did gain a lot of experience in the fact that Bartholomew Diaz diverted well away from the west coast of Africa with sailing south. I don't know, chicken and egg, really. I don't know.
I think in the early sailing days, they were only on the coast during daylight hours, and at night time they'd have to sail out into the ocean and try and come back to the coast the next day. So it wasn't as though they were powered into the coast all the time. They had to be careful not to run aground on islands and reefs and rocks and even the coastline.
Well, you can see in one of these illustrations here how early on they figured out the currents and how they operate in that part of the North Atlantic and the prevailing winds. So that when ships were returning, when they eventually discovered the Cape and beyond, when they returned, they wouldn't just continue the easiest way up. They'd go out here to catch these southwesterlies and the currents back to Portugal. But they did learn a lot actually from the local sailors in East Africa and around the Gulf of Persian Gulf. They learned from them all about the monsoons and the prevailing winds and the prevailing currents, and those things were well known by the local mariners for hundreds of years, and the Portuguese used that experience to help.
Great presentation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
I think there's some wonderful maps there and some wonderful contentious ideas.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dave.
Thanks, Bill.
You know, and thank you all for coming along and seeing our guest presenter. It has been I think, a very interesting and informative experience. I mean, personally, I'm sort of still, I'm of two minds, but I think there's some hard evidence there that possibly Tasker, who is not our current president, possibly is related. It would be interesting to see what the argument really is to say definitively that the Portuguese didn't find Australia.
It was their stomping ground.
Yeah.
Southeast Asia.
So, is there any more questions or comments from the audience?
I want it to be true.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's another thing that Tasker says. There's a lot of wishful thinking.
I want it to be true.
Yeah.
Who first, the name Terra Australis seems to be, who first used that? Was that a Portuguese? Yeah, but who first?
Oh, I think that goes way back to Roman times. I think I'm not really sure.
I thought that the original agreement between Spain and Portugal for the split of the world put the split between east and west roughly where the West Australian border is. On your map, it seems somewhat further east than that.
Yeah, it's moved around a bit in people's minds because they didn't know really where Australia was, but I think it's now pretty well recognised that it was sort of came down through the Gulf of Carpentaria and down around the that area. Yeah.
David,
I was reading about the New South Wales Victorian border and the Queensland border moving up that traditional line. And the Queensland border went further east.
Yeah, yeah. There's some reason that there's a bit of a kink, isn't there, over near the western border of Queensland. Yeah.
Well, of course, after American Wills, we wanted to get that.
Yeah.
David, can I ask the authentication of these maps? When was it done? Who did it? What was the methodology? Is all that information available?
Not really, no, because
That would be my big issue.
yeah.
I want to know who, when, how.
Well, that is a mystery. How the Dieppe people got their hands on those maps, we don't know because the Portuguese were very secretive.
Now, but in modern times, when we look at those maps,
Yeah.
are there people doing proper scientific analysis, and who are those people, and where was it done, and what methodologies were they used? Yeah, well, there's been some pretty good forgeries done.
Oh yeah, yeah. But these maps have changed hands for millions of dollars, and I don't think the Huntington Library in California would have gone ahead with it without some scientific investigation. But I'm not personally aware of what happened.
Next time we leave.
Could it all be the Chinese that discovered it all?
Could be.
They all go by the Chinese, because there's also detail. And what year was Marco Polo? He got to China or over to Europe? All that information.
Well, he was in the 1200s, wasn't he, Marco Polo?
But not the Chinese, but they discovered it.
Yeah, who knows? And it's important to keep an open mind, I think.
Yeah.